I learned early that silence was safer than honesty. Not because anyone told me to stay quiet outright, but because every time I spoke honestly, something uncomfortable followed. Confusion. Disapproval. Tension. Silence, on the other hand, kept things smooth. Predictable. Manageable. So I adapted. I listened more than I spoke. I agreed more than I questioned. I smiled when I felt uncertain. People called me easygoing. Mature. Reasonable. What they didn't see was how much of myself I was folding away to stay that way. At first, silence felt like control. I believed that by not reacting, not pushing, not insisting, I was being strong. That I was choosing peace over conflict, wisdom over impulse. I didn't notice when silence stopped being a choice. I became the person who never caused trouble. The one who understood everyone else's perspective. The one who could always be relied on to be okay with things. Inside, I wasn't okay. But silence made that invisible. Whenever something bothered me, I explained it away. It's not that important. Whenever I felt hurt, I minimized it. They didn't mean it. Whenever I wanted something different, I postponed it. This isn't the right time. Silence became my default response to discomfort. And comfort became my enemy. Years passed like this. Smoothly. Quietly. Without resistance. My life looked stable from the outside, relationships intact, routine steady, no obvious crises. Inside, something was eroding. I started feeling distant from my own reactions. When things happened, I noticed them intellectually but felt nothing emotionally. As if my inner voice had learned not to speak too loudly, or at all. I mistook numbness for calm. I thought I was grounded. In reality, I was disconnected. I watched my life happen without my participation. Decisions were made around me, sometimes for me, and I accepted them without protest. Not because they aligned with me, but because challenging them felt unnecessary. I told myself that wanting more would only complicate things. So I stopped wanting. Or rather, I stopped listening to want. The strange thing about silence is that it doesn't feel dangerous. It feels responsible. It doesn't demand action. It doesn't draw attention. It lets you disappear politely. I became fluent in disappearing. I noticed how often I adjusted myself to fit situations I didn't choose. How often I let others define the pace, the priorities, the direction. How rarely I stopped to ask whether any of it reflected me. But I didn't question it seriously. Because nothing was wrong enough. And that's how it happens. You don't lose yourself in moments of crisis. You lose yourself in long stretches of tolerance. In days where you tell yourself this is fine often enough that it becomes your identity. I remember the moment something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No argument. No breakdown. Someone asked me a simple question, "What do you want?" I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out. Not because I didn't want anything. Because I didn't know how to access it anymore. That silence felt different. Heavy. Exposed. For the first time, I realized that staying quiet hadn't protected me. It had erased me. I had spent so long being agreeable that I no longer recognized my own voice. My opinions felt theoretical. My preferences uncertain. My desires distant, like memories that belonged to someone else. That terrified me. Because it meant I hadn't just avoided conflict. I had avoided myself. I started noticing how often I felt like a guest in my own life. Present, but not participating. Observing my days instead of shaping them. Accepting outcomes instead of choosing directions. Silence had kept everything calm. It had also kept everything empty. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The question wasn't whether silence had cost me something. The question was whether I could still find what I had lost, or whether staying quiet for so long had made that impossible. Once I realized how much silence had taken from me, it stopped feeling neutral. It started to feel heavy. I became aware of it everywhere, in conversations where I nodded while something inside me quietly disagreed, in decisions I accepted without enthusiasm, in relationships where I was present but never fully seen. Silence wasn't just something I did. It was something I lived inside. I began to notice how often I rehearsed my thoughts internally and then dismissed them before they reached my mouth. How instinctively I filtered myself for comfort, not my own, but everyone else's. I had developed an internal editor that erased anything inconvenient, emotional, or uncertain. That editor worked fast. Too fast. By the time I noticed discomfort, it was already gone, smoothed over, rationalized, buried. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I didn't clarify. I adapted. And adaptation, stretched over years, becomes self-erasure. The internal breakdown didn't come as an explosion. It came as confusion. A growing inability to tell whether my reactions were genuine or automatic. Whether I liked things or had simply learned to tolerate them well. I caught myself agreeing to plans and wondering afterward why I felt resentful. Listening to people talk about me as if they knew me, and realizing I had given them no real information to work with. They weren't misunderstanding me. They were responding to the version I had presented. That realization hurt. Because it meant I couldn't blame anyone for not knowing me. I had taught them that I didn't require much space. That I was flexible. That I was fine. I had trained the world to expect my silence. The resentment I felt toward others turned inward quickly. I was angry at myself for staying quiet when it mattered. For choosing harmony over honesty so consistently that honesty no longer felt accessible. I wondered when exactly I had decided that my inner world was negotiable. That question didn't have a clear answer. It wasn't one moment. It was a pattern. A long sequence of small silences that felt reasonable at the time. Each one insignificant on its own. Together, devastating. I began to grieve something abstract but profound. Not a relationship. Not an opportunity. My voice. I grieved the version of me who used to speak without overthinking, who reacted honestly, who trusted that expressing discomfort wouldn't destroy everything. I couldn't remember when that version had faded, only that they were gone. And grief demands acknowledgement. Ignoring it only deepens the loss. The moral dilemma arrived quietly but firmly. Do you continue staying silent because it keeps things stable, predictable, calm? Or do you risk disrupting everything by speaking, knowing that your voice, once unused for so long, might come out shaky, imperfect, even misunderstood? Staying silent felt familiar. Safe. It promised acceptance. It promised that nothing would change. Speaking felt dangerous. What if I hurt people? What if I was wrong? What if my truth sounded selfish after all this time? And perhaps the most frightening thought, what if I spoke, and no one listened? Silence had protected me from rejection. It had also protected others from knowing me. Breaking it meant exposing myself to outcomes I couldn't control. But staying silent meant something worse. It meant continuing to live a life where my presence didn't require me. I realized then that silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was suffocating. I started noticing physical signs of that suffocation. Tightness in my chest during conversations. Fatigue after social interactions that required constant self-editing. A lingering sense of invisibility even in rooms full of people. I wasn't lonely. I was unheard, even by myself. The realization was devastating and clarifying at the same time. Silence had helped me survive. But it was preventing me from living. I understood then that silence is not the absence of conflict. It's the absence of truth. And truth, when denied long enough, turns inward. It becomes resentment. It becomes numbness. It becomes the quiet feeling that you are not fully here. I didn't want to disappear quietly. I didn't want to wake up years later and realize that no one had ever truly known me, because I had never allowed it. The question was no longer whether silence had cost me something. The question was whether I was willing to pay the price of reclaiming my voice. Because reclaiming it would not be gentle. It would be awkward. Late. Unpolished. And it would change things. That was the risk. Stay silent and remain intact but invisible. Or speak and risk becoming real. I didn't know which choice I would make yet. But for the first time, I understood this much: silence was no longer neutral. It was choosing for me. The first time I spoke after all that silence, my voice didn't sound like mine. It was quieter than I expected. Unsteady. As if it hadn't been used in years, because it hadn't. I remember noticing that before I noticed what I was actually saying. How strange it felt to hear my own words take up space in the room. Nothing dramatic followed. No one yelled. No one walked out. No catastrophe unfolded. And that, somehow, was the most unsettling part. I had built silence on the belief that speaking would destroy something fragile. That honesty would rupture relationships, expose me, make me unlovable or difficult or selfish. But when I finally spoke, the world didn't collapse. It shifted. Subtly. Unevenly. Irreversibly. Some people were surprised. Some were confused. A few didn't like it. They were used to a version of me that never pushed back, never clarified, never took up room. My voice disrupted an order that had formed around my quietness. That disruption came with consequences. Certain dynamics changed overnight. Conversations became shorter. Expectations adjusted. I felt the loss of ease, the smoothness that silence had always provided. Being agreeable had been simple. Being honest was not. But something else happened too. I felt real. Not confident. Not powerful. Real. I noticed how my body reacted when I spoke truthfully, even awkwardly. My chest felt lighter afterward. My thoughts felt clearer. The familiar exhaustion that followed social interactions began to ease, replaced by something else: alertness. Presence. I realized then how much energy silence had required. How constantly I had been monitoring myself, editing reactions, swallowing words. Speaking was uncomfortable, but it was also efficient. It stopped the internal negotiation before it could drain me. Of course, I didn't suddenly become outspoken or fearless. I didn't start saying everything that crossed my mind. Reclaiming my voice wasn't about volume. It was about permission. Permission to disagree without apologizing for existing. Permission to say no without explaining myself into exhaustion. Permission to admit uncertainty instead of hiding behind compliance. Each time I used that permission, it felt like stepping onto unstable ground. My instincts were rusty. I often questioned myself afterward. Wondered if I had been too much, too late, too unclear. But even those doubts felt different. They were mine. Some relationships didn't survive the change. Not because I attacked or accused, but because they had relied on my silence to function. When I stopped absorbing everything quietly, there was nothing left holding them together. That loss hurt. I mourned it honestly. But I also understood it. If my presence only worked when I was quiet, then I had never truly been present in those spaces to begin with. Other relationships deepened. Slowly. Carefully. When I allowed myself to be heard, not perfectly, not eloquently, something unexpected happened. People began responding to me, not just the role I played. Those connections felt unfamiliar at first. They required vulnerability instead of endurance. And vulnerability was something I had avoided my entire life. I began to recognize how often I had confused silence with kindness. How often I had believed that minimizing myself was a form of generosity. I saw now that true kindness includes honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it disrupts peace. Especially then. The biggest change, though, happened internally. I started hearing myself again. Not just my spoken voice, but the quieter one, the one that notices discomfort early, that reacts before logic smooths everything over, that knows when something doesn't fit long before I can explain why. That voice had never left. It had just been ignored. I learned that losing yourself doesn't require trauma or chaos. It only requires consistent self-silencing. A long habit of choosing ease over truth. A belief that harmony is more important than authenticity. I lived that belief for years. And it almost erased me. Reclaiming my voice didn't fix everything. My life didn't suddenly feel aligned or meaningful all the time. There are still moments when I hesitate, when old habits resurface, when silence feels tempting again. But now I recognize what silence costs me. It costs me presence. It costs me agency. It costs me myself. So when I choose to speak now, even imperfectly, it isn't about being heard by others. It's about not abandoning myself. If you're listening to this and you recognize that quiet shrinking inside you, if you've learned to stay agreeable, adaptable, easy, while slowly disappearing, I want you to know something clearly: your voice doesn't need to be loud to matter. It doesn't need to be polished to be valid. It doesn't need permission to exist. Silence may have kept you safe once. But if it's costing you your sense of self, it's no longer protection. It's a prison. I stayed quiet too long. And in that quiet, I lost myself. Finding my way back didn't require shouting. It required one honest sentence spoken despite fear. Then another. And another. That's how I learned this: you don't lose yourself all at once. And you don't find yourself all at once either. You come back to yourself every time you choose truth over silence, even when your voice shakes. Especially then.